Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Cipher Brief Studio. I'm Suzanne Kelly here with our COO, Brad Christian, and of course, Alicia Volpe, our CMO. We want to thank you very much for joining us for lessons from the dark side of national security, what you need to know about the dark web, and how it trades on open source and geopolitical events. I have been nerding out for a few minutes ahead of time with our guest today. I have been so looking forward to this conversation because I feel like it's one that is not happening enough in today's environment. So I hope that you, along with me, will walk away from the next hour feeling a lot more informed on issues that are becoming more and more important in everyday life for all of us. So I'd like to thank Recorded Future for their sponsorship of today's session. It's a real pleasure to work with them. I've known our guest Christopher Ahlberg for a few years now, and he is someone I always enjoy engaging with. He is incredibly insightful and passionate about technology and security. More on Christopher and Alex Cresswell, who has his own impressive background. I'm very proud to say he's a Cipher Brief expert. More on them in just a moment. First, a quick announcement and a couple of logistics. Thanks to the generous support of Recorded Future, today's session is open to everyone. If you're interested in more sessions like this one, please consider becoming a full member of the Cipher Brief. I guarantee you there is no better way to stay informed on today's most pressing national security issues for just $10 a month. You can join us at thecipherbrief.com. We have a number of journalists on today's call. I'd like to welcome you guys. It has been a challenging year to report on stories that are incredibly important regarding national security, given COVID restrictions and everything else. Just a hats off to you guys for what you're doing and keeping the public informed on these issues. Today's briefing is on the record, by the way. We invite all attendees to submit your questions to us for our speakers, also for our presenter, using the link on the webinar page if you're joining us via your laptop. That's in the chat box. It's on the control panel on the right-hand side there. If you're joining on your phone or it's just too difficult to kind of figure that out, you can always shoot us an email with your question. You can send it to Brad Christian at bchristian@thecipherbrief.com. I encourage you to get those questions in a little on the early side if you can. We always run out of time to answer most of our questions, and I anticipate that's going to happen today as well. So please send those questions in at any time. You know, when I sat down to create this session, there were a couple of things that I wanted to accomplish. One was providing a better understanding to those of us who don't do cyber every day of what we've been hearing about for years, which is this mysterious place called the dark web. We kind of know what it is. It's a place where shadowy figures hang out and do bad things, but that's not actually the complete picture. So before I welcome today's guest, I want to first welcome Charity Wright. Charity is a cyber threat intelligence analyst with Recorded Future. She also has more than 15 years experience working with the US Army and the NSA, where she translated Mandarin Chinese. She now specializes in dark web intelligence. Charity, it's so great to be able to welcome you here. And I really want to thank you for being willing to give us kind of a primer, if you will, for the next 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes on what the dark web is and kind of like what you're seeing happening there from an analytical perspective.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Suzanne. I appreciate being here. It is an honor. So I am going to present my screen. Let's see if I can.
This is great. I feel like COVID hasn't kept us from the classroom environment. This is awesome.
Exactly. I think I'm going to need somebody to throw the slides up for me, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. We're getting on it for you right now.
Awesome. Thank you.
So give us a sense while we're getting that prepped, it'll take us just a couple seconds here, of what you do in your role at Recorded Future in sort of monitoring what's going on in dark web.
Absolutely. I work with a phenomenal research team. We get to research topics from cybersecurity issues and also national security and geopolitical issues. So personally, I get to specialize in the China mission, which is what I did in a national security perspective in my military career. And we monitor everything from hacking activity to disinformation.
Excellent. Well, Charity, I think we've got all our stuff ready to go. Let's get to it. I'm excited about this.
Awesome. Yes. This is one of my favorite topics. Let me see if I'm able to drive the slides there. And
I
we
don't
have,
think you're going to be able to.
okay, then I'll just say
Got it.
next slide.
Yep, yep. Pink.
Awesome. Okay, so the internet as we know it today is, widely accessible to most people around the world. The clear web, or what we call the open web, is accessible through typical web browsers like Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and Edge. Now, most people know and understand how to use the internet in that way. You type in a URL and it opens a publicly accessible website. Or you can just search for a website or content using a search engine. Let's go to the next slide. The dark web, however, is a part of the internet that most people don't know how to access. Some estimates show that only 1% of the general population has ever visited the dark web. And the dark web is accessible through a special web browser called Tor, T-O-R, or the Onion Router, which basically anonymizes your web browsing through a series of encryptions. Now, Tor browsing allows you ultimate privacy. So your browsing activity cannot be monitored or censored. Now, you could see why this would be very tempting for all kinds of people, including criminals that want to circumvent law enforcement. Next slide, please. Now, there are all kinds of myths and stereotypes about the dark web, probably because not very many people have visited or know anything about it. So let's shed some light on the dark web. Myth number one, the dark web is bad. We can go ahead and click on the screen there. Actually, the dark web is not inherently evil. It has a bad reputation because it's hidden, exclusive, and secretive. But it really is no more evil than the clear web. Tor was actually developed and funded in part by a US Naval Research Lab in the 1990s for clandestine operations. Can we click on that screen there? There you go. So myth number two, only criminals use the dark web. And although it is well known as the criminal underground due to its poor reputation for, sales of guns and drugs and human trafficking, even pornography, the dark web is also used by innocent people all around the world. In many countries, people are suppressed by authoritarian governments and are severely restricted in the information that they can access. Our research actually shows that in countries where the government has strict control over what people can read and access on the internet, those populations often use the dark web to circumvent those restrictions to access innocent things like news, academic materials, or even contact loved ones overseas. Myth number three, accessing the dark web is a crime. Well, actually, accessing the dark web is legal in most countries, like in the United States. Accessing the dark web through Tor will not put you on the FBI watch list. I get that a lot. The FBI, they obviously have bigger fish to fry. However, if you live in a country where Tor is banned, it could be a crime. That includes countries like China, Russia, Venezuela, Vietnam, and many more. These countries banned Tor because they want to censor and monitor how their citizens use the internet. Next slide, please. Now, this is a screenshot of the Tor browser homepage. The Tor browser is the easiest and most popular way to access dark websites. It's based on Firefox and works like a bare bones version of any other web browser. It's pretty much plug and play, so there's no special tweaks or configurations to start browsing anonymously after the initial setup. And to visit a dark website, it's very much like you would use a normal browser. You type in the URL and then it's .onion at the end. Now, the thing about dark websites is usually the URLs are a very obscure combination of characters, and you would have to know the exact URL you want to visit. So where would one browse to once Tor is downloaded? I guess that probably depends on what you want to see or do. Now, law enforcement might visit sites for drug sales, human trafficking, or weapons auctions in an effort to find the criminals that are running those illegal businesses. But for those of us in cybersecurity, we're specifically looking for fraudsters and cyber criminals that are doing business on the dark web. So let me show you some dark websites that are common use cases for us. Next slide. One of the easiest ways for a cyber criminal to gain access to your accounts or your business accounts is by buying compromised credentials. Now, there are dozens of markets and leak sites where criminal hackers dump these stolen usernames and passwords. This screenshot is an example of what that looks like on a marketplace. It works very similarly to eBay or Amazon, which you might be more familiar with. You find the product that you want. You can even search. There's usually a search box in the marketplace. Then you just press a button to check if it's available, like in this particular screenshot. It tells you in real time if that product is still available, and then you click buy or add to cart. So you pay using cryptocurrency. Usually it's Bitcoin, but some marketplaces accept other cryptocurrency as well. And then the product is delivered to you as soon as your blockchain payment goes through to them. So sometimes they deliver it to you right there on your screen where you can see the compromised website with a username and password to log in. And other times the seller will request to send it to you through a private message app. So these products are purchased by both criminal and by nation state directed hackers. Next slide, please. This screenshot here is from RAID forums. Now what you see here is another popular threat vector is purchasing accesses to servers on these dark web markets. So this screenshot is an ad for server access to over 10,000 companies, which works especially well for ransomware groups, which they even specify in the advertisement. Now, this particular seller, he says, or he or she says, they're not going to disclose the specific companies that are compromised because that would obviously compromise his business too. However, they do often give descriptions of the businesses that they're selling access to. They might list, you know, how much revenue the company makes each year, what their geographic location might be, some details like that that may hint to who they've compromised. We can click on this slide again for another screenshot. Now this screenshot here is Russian market, and they're selling, this is a dashboard that allows one to search for accesses to RDP accounts. So this would allow a hacker remote access to your personal or your work desktop, which is especially useful since COVID has pushed many employees to remote work. Next slide, please. Now, in the criminal underground, personal communication is extremely important. We're talking about individuals that are basically running enterprises, huge businesses. They have HR departments, they have customer service 24/7. So obviously communication is just as important to them as it is to running a normal business. Cyber criminals have always used private messaging platforms to discuss business dealings and negotiate deals. So they plot and they plan their intrusion campaigns through these IM platforms. And over the years, they've become increasingly popular because law enforcement and security researchers like us have been spying and exposing these illegal dealings. So they go into private message to kind of circumvent being seen on the forums and exposing the details of their business. Now, one popular Russian cybercrime forum called exploit.in runs a massive Jabber infrastructure. Jabber, which is also known as XMPP, is an open source federated instant messenger with thousands of independent servers and upwards of 10 million users around the world. Jabber server administrators, they promise users no logging, strong privacy, and very reliable service, which is extremely appealing for these criminals. But you know what? They also use other IM applications like ICQ, Telegram, WhatsApp, and in Latin America, Facebook Messenger is actually one of the most popular messaging platforms for these criminals to use. Next slide, please. Now, you know, oftentimes when we talk about national security, the focus is on nation state sponsored groups. However, criminal activity is also a big national security threat. As we've seen over the past few years, ransomware has posed an enormous threat to national security, not only to the US, but to other countries around the world. And we're not just talking about Colonial pipeline, which has been in the news recently. Also, hospitals, schools, universities, and military units are all being targeted by ransomware threat actors. And only recently did, you know, a few ransomware groups decide to kind of step back from targeting civil or social organizations, but most of them do not follow a code of ethics. Next slide, please. Great. And finally, you know, another major threat to national security and societies around the world is disinformation. The propagation of false information has really wreaked havoc throughout the ages, but over the past 10 years, with the widespread adoption of internet news and tech around the world, nation states like Russia, China, and Iran are using disinformation to gain an advantage over their adversaries. Disinformation is also sold as a service in the dark web. Not many people know that. But today, you can actually pay criminals to spread false narratives and harmful messaging about politicians, political parties, the integrity of democracies, and also private companies. There have been several major incidents in the past where deepfake videos and photos were maliciously spread to harm a company's reputation. The top disinformation as a service offerings in the dark web are from Russian threat actors today, but we actually see these offerings happening in every language in dark web forums from all different regions of the world. One last slide. We have to touch on this topic because let me tell you, the threat of domestic extremism and terrorism is rampant in the underground web. Violent, radicalized individuals and groups have been observed planning and plotting terrorist attacks, riots, and insurrections in underground forums and chat rooms. Last week, top US law enforcement officials from our major law enforcement agencies said that the biggest domestic terror threats come from white supremacists. Although there are radicalized groups on both sides of the political spectrum all over the world, and also foreign terrorism. You can find foreign terrorist chat rooms and forums in the underground web as well. So essentially, From a cybersecurity perspective, by monitoring, observing, and analyzing the criminals' plans, activities, and plots, we're able to proactively alert authorities and defend against them. So Suzanne, that is a summary of the dark web as fast as we could possibly do. There's so much more to dig into, so I'm really looking forward to hearing this conversation.
Charity, thank you so much. You make it look so easy. I think sometimes we have an idea of it, but if you're not in it every day and you don't actually have your fingers on the keyboard, it's much, much harder to sort of understand the depth and everything that happens there, and how the communication leads to success with a lot of the things that some of the darker side, dark web people are plotting. So thank you so much for giving us this. Very, very helpful.
Thank you.
All right. Let me turn now to our guest today to sort of figure out how we put this in perspective and what this means for today's national security threats and, of course, threats to business, which can also be linked to national security issues. Cipher brief expert Alex Cresswell left the British Foreign Service in 2020 after 27 years in a variety of national security roles, often including a technology angle. He has led an operational division of GCHQ. For those of you who haven't heard of GCHQ, it's sort of like the US version of the NSA. They work very closely with businesses, though, not exactly the same thing, but he's also served in the Cabinet Office directing the team of analysts, which is known as the Joint Intelligence Organization, which provides the British Prime Minister's daily briefing and strategic assessments for their national security community. Christopher Ahlberg is the CEO of Recorded Future and chairman of Hult International Business School. He advises a series of startup companies and was the president of the Spotfire division of TIBCO, which he founded in 1996 and then in 2007 sold for $195 million. Not a bad few years' work. Spotfire was founded based on his groundbreaking research on information visualization, which is why I'm so excited to welcome him to this conversation today, because it's really important that I think a broader community understand a lot of these concepts in ways that are easy to understand, to really kind of know what's coming and what we need to be more aware of. Disinformation was one of the things, of course, that Charity mentioned. Gentlemen, we just got this fantastic overview. Thank you both so much for being here and helping us understand now what this means. I thought we might start the conversation off by me asking each of you to share your thoughts for just a few minutes on how today's dark web has sort of evolved and what your top concerns are now. Alex, why don't we start with you? I think you might.
That's very kind of you, and I'm honored to be here, Suzanne. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, I've got you now. There was a small lag. Go ahead.
Is it working now?
Yep.
So I think I might just start off by saying, what Charity showed was the degree of specialization on the dark web amongst cyber criminal groups. It's truly startling how specialized a marketplace from access to how there is two different and companies, including government IT systems, all the way through to the people who negotiate the ransoms and who monetize the attacks, and the people who provide the tools, who provide the tools that kind of brute force passwords or that insert malware. It's all very segmented today. But there is a slight sense that the Colonial pipeline attack and others like it were a step too far. And what was really interesting about the Colonial pipeline attack is that DarkSide, if you like, the group that designed the software, the malware that went into that attack and then allowed affiliates to use it, communicated that they almost communicated an apology during the attack, and one sensed that there was some degree of pressure on them, possibly from the Russian state, which is where basically they are based. And just really interestingly, we're starting to see some of these cyber threat actor groups bring the specialization back in-house and start to think, oh gosh, you know, we allowed our malware to be used by these affiliate groups. We did do a bit of vetting of them, but we don't really know whether they're going to be as careful with their attacks as we would like. So perhaps we're going to bring some of this back in-house and restrict the numbers in our group who are going to do more things. So bring it back. So a group like some of the high-end groups that we're seeing, like one called Defray, you know, you just get a sense that they're going to bring it back in-house. They're going to have a fewer number of people doing these attacks. So I just pointed that, and then I'm sure it'll come up. And in fact, Charity alluded to it elliptically. A couple of the malware forums in Russia have, over the last week, come out publicly and said, we will not run ads for ransomware anymore. So the two big ones, XSS and exploit.in, and that's a really big story. Feels like a big development, and it feels like it just might be that they're feeling a bit of heat, possibly because they don't want to antagonize an incoming Biden administration. You know, we haven't had the first big bilateral between President and Putin. Who knows? But you know, that's a kind of an interesting trend that we're seeing out there.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. I'm already jotting down questions, but Christopher, I'm going to keep listening. Give us sort of your sense. You know, you've done so much in this space. I feel like you have a better handle on it than some small countries do. What are you seeing? What trends and what worries you?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I do like the point that Alex makes about sort of vertical integration, and maybe some of the very high-end groups like Revil and so on will try to do that. Sort of go Apple versus distributed Microsoft PC sort of distributed framework where you lose control. Now, it's harder to do, and it may lose some of the economics because, frankly, the reason that this has been so proliferated is just the money. You say you take the competence that these guys have, well-educated Russians who live in godforsaken places with good internet connections and with little other economic opportunity. It's sort of, you have to go do ransomware. It's sort of like, it's just very natural that the sort of the geopolitics of it, or whatever, the inertia of it, whatever you want to call it, makes you want to go make money. And that sort of distributed nature of this has sort of been the forums here that we've, you know, exploit. We've already talked about Maza, Korovka. I'll be coming back and talk a little bit about Maza a couple of times. That we've always had a good iris out for the guys at Maza. And it's sort of, you know, these guys, these places have been around for 15, 20 years and continue to proliferate. And if you think about it, it's pretty amazing that these sort of just, I don't know what to call them, pots of criminal activity that just kept boiling, simmering at a nice pace for 15, 20 years inside a nation state that, you know, it's still a nation state with laws, and it's operating there. And it's, you know, that honor about among thieves here in terms of what to do and not. So it's funny now, suddenly it's like, don't, you know, they've been going after hospitals for years and nobody's complained very much, and they do something with pipelines and Americans lose their access to gas, and now it's like, what the, you know, now that's one step too far. And sort of then suddenly everything, you know, to my mind, the Irish healthcare system should be a little bit, you know, above that in rank order. But who knows? We'll talk a little bit more about sort of where that pressure point may have happened. I do think, you know, from an intelligence point of view, it's pretty amazing that the fact that we've had these guys all be in this dark web, you know, these places, because it means that once they're in the one place, you can observe them. And the cool thing about these forums is, as opposed to the typical spy who is not necessarily walking around and declaring his intents, you might find out ways to get to his capabilities, but his intents are harder to get to. But in these forums, they babble, they talk, and so you can get to intents, which is pretty unique when it comes to sort of observance. So in that, from an intelligence point of view, these guys start dispersing, go private, you know, in all kinds of different places, changes the nature of how you go collect intelligence on them. But I don't know, those are probably some initial thoughts here.
I think it's fascinating. And we heard, you know, last year we talked to Kevin Mandia over at FireEye before the whole SolarWinds attack, of course, which changed his whole year. But he really said last year was the year of ransomware. With COVID, more people working from home, we're just seeing a massive explosion, and it hasn't tended to subside. in 2021, and with sort of the world coming out of the COVID pandemic, hopefully soon. But I wonder, Alex, you mentioned, this whole idea of like socially responsible groups now that are saying we're not going to do certain things, we're going to pull this back in because they don't want to feel the heat. I wonder what is the heat? So from the sort of normal US citizen perspective, bad guys do things, the government tells you that they're addressing it, but they don't necessarily tell you how, and so you're left in this fog of not really understanding when you do something wrong, like in a normal police environment. It's easy to police. You come, you find the person who perpetrated it, and they pay a price. How does this work in the dark web? I mean, and is there a way to better police things like ransomware or not?
It's really difficult. So in a word, I think the vast majority of the cyber criminal actors are that come at corporate USA or corporate Europe come from three countries, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. The bits of Ukraine that that are outside government control, and so that is why it's really hard to get at these guys. You can't extradite them. You can't bring criminal proceedings as you normally would. And I'm sure Christopher will speak a bit about this. But there is a kind of ant and aphid relationship, we think, between some of these criminal actors and the Russian state. And I can go into that a bit more deeply. In terms of, you talked about a kind of code of honor amongst thieves, and Charity said, some organizations were saying that they were not going to go after hospitals, etc. But against that is the profit motive, because what we notice is that certain of these actors have developed really strong expertise in how you target healthcare institutions. Healthcare institutions will often, by definition, particularly if they are state funded, have legacy software in their stack, and if you threaten to turn off the oxygen at a hospital, that's quite motivating in terms of getting a ransom payment out. Now, I have to say, my shout out this week would go to Michael Martin, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister of Ireland, who is refusing to pay ransomware to the attackers of the Irish Health Services Executive. In fact, there was a wag in the Irish media who said that the Irish HSC healthcare service had agreed to talk to the ransomware guys and negotiate with them, and they could have an appointment in 2 or 3 years' time, like everyone else. But apart from that, no. I think going back to your original question, the reason why we can't get at these guys is because of where they are. And that gives our governments very few options. They can do two things. One, they can try and raise the personal cost of these cyber attackers having been implicated in cyber attacks. So that is, you see FBI indictments actually naming people, which is great. And two, they can try and take down some of their infrastructure. So, I think that the rumors around the end of last year was that the TrickBot the malware infrastructure, it disappeared. It was very much disrupted. That did deal a real blow to some of these groups, and they had to reinvent that. And the thought was that nation state, Western nation state intelligence services were behind that.
Okay, so Christopher, let me ask you the hard question. Who is better positioned to make a dent in some of the crime and some of the bad things that are happening on the dark web, governments or private sector?
It has to be government. I am not a big believer in the sort of the hack back sort of ideas, and I think Alex is right. It is very hard. I was going to use this guy, Dmitry Alexandrovich Dokuchev. I'm sure I'm botching his name somewhat. as a case in point here, it's wonderful to look at his Wikipedia page. He's born in 1984, relatively young man. He was sort of known as a hacker in the early 2000s, went under the moniker Forb, and was one of the original starters of this Maza forum that still exists out there, and it's incredibly hard to get into Maza. I remember, I'll leave that story aside, but it's hard to get into Maza. We'll just put it that way. And you look at his sort of what Wikipedia holds him up as an occupation these days, FSB officer. He's known for hacking, and his conviction is for treason. It's sort of a pretty crazy story with this dude. But so he was a hacker and started this Maza forum that was one of the original sort of places where the bad guys were hanging out. It's unknown, I think, whether he did that under the umbrella of FSB or they saw that he did it and co-opted him. Yeah. How exactly that played out back in 2004-05 is unknown, at least to me. But what is interesting is that very quickly they got their hands around him, and he's been one of the key players for FSB in all of this. And then over time, they've used this Maza thing as a recruiting ground for recruiting the best and the top tier hackers in there, and he'd been able to use that expertise. So then if you go back and look at the indictment after the election, it's very interesting. So there was 3 officers and 2 criminals. The 2 criminals were this one guy, Balin, and the other guy, Bogachev. Bogachev is the guy with the great boats and all this stuff, and tigers and all this sort of thing. But Balin, and you read the text about Balin, Alexei Balin, blah, 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 indicted 3 times. And he conspired with 3 Russian intelligence officers, including Dmitry Alexandrovich Dokachev. And so, here are these criminals that have known each other for 15, 20 years, and they were all the way part of the election hacking that went down here, a couple of years ago, and this stuff. So, and these guys are all in one sort of hodgepodge here. So I think it just means that, for us to sort of believe that we send a letter to Putin and say, just please stop, it's we've created sort of an environment here where we weaponized our social media so they could get to our brains, and we weaponized our whole our whole sort of I call it information technology infrastructure, across the world by making it so vulnerable. So the opportunities for Russia to play at that with not as much resources, it's perfect judo move here by sort of having these guys that can get away with doing all this, whether it's for economic gain or state gain. There's not much sort of in it, if you want it, for Putin to sort of do anything.
Yeah,
if I was
no incentive. Yeah, and it was interesting too that you painted, I think, a really fantastic picture of how some countries have an advantage where they have high populations of people who aren't working. They need something to do. It's not necessarily the free democracies of the West, and it's a lot easier to recruit people in. Alex, let me ask you, you have looked at these issues from government perspectives in the course of your career, and what is needed? Is there sort of, if someone waved a magic wand and gave the government a particular skill set or resource that they could tap into to make much more of a dent in what we're seeing today, which often feels like just wild, wild west, is there something that governments could use? And, may I just present the idea that we've heard in our cyber summit for the Cipher brief back in March, of the idea of creating like a civil service, so that somehow Western countries can compete in the cyber domain with criminal organizations that are often linked to nation states.
Yeah, it's very difficult, Suzanne, to think of what can be done. So, what would be fantastic, obviously, would be to have the kind of relationship with Russia which would allow us to have an extradition treaty. That would be great. But if you can't do that, then I think you're left with how can you solidify your own perimeter fences? And I think on the civil service sort of side, there, you are starting to see, obviously in the US, CISA, etc. And now in other countries, a building up of those defenses, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. There have been you know, there is interestingly some talk out there about, you know, will there be legislation to prevent the payment of ransomware ransoms? And that, you know, is just talk at this point. I just noticed, interestingly, that over in France, their biggest insurance company, AXA, has you know, said it won't be paying ransomware payments. I think it becomes very problematic, though, when you are you know, you are needing to resolve very difficult situations where criminals have kind of stopped large bits of your infrastructure. I think the way through this is to continue doing what has been done, which is to take down the infrastructure, to make it harder for criminal actors to do what they're doing at scale. I think that's the only thing we can currently do without a legal arrangement with the countries which harbor these people.
Which probably isn't
right. Ultimately, this will take legal arrangements with Russia. But again, I think there's just no incentive for Putin to do that. This provides him with an inherent capability he needs to not just, I would call it stay in power, to retain his sort of stature in the world. It's an important part of his power. And, you know, I'm a man of action. I'd love to have us go hack, you know, whatever these things to pieces. But the problem is, again, I'm not an expert on Russia, but if I was Putin and I saw us doing that, or, you know, I would say that not only are you sort of hacking some criminal guys' computers, you're coming at Russian, you know, I don't know, call it assets or Russian this and that, and even if it's run by a criminal gang, he's not going to like that. And now
danger.
That may not be great.
Yeah, an inherent danger in doing that. Let me ask you, Christopher, how common or uncommon is collaboration between the Russian government and Russian criminal collaboration actually in practice, beyond sort of providing cover for what goes on in the dark web? Is there closer collaboration than that?
No, so I think there's sort of, you know, there's tons of low-level guys here, you know, low-level sort of, where sort of the difference between hacker and criminal is probably, you know, pretty low, and you know, there's no collaboration. Then there are sort of mid-tier criminals of various sorts. You know, we cover a guy here, you know, Flint 24 was a guy that we spent time on over the last couple of years, and he was covered by some local Minister of Interior, MBD guys in Russia, sort of had some local air cover sort of thing. And then again, you have these sort of guys like Dukac here that, you know, was recruited into the FSB. Then you have other guys like Belan and Bogachev, who are, you know, still on their own, but certainly have great air cover or roof or whatever. I can't say it in Russian here, but, you know, whatever the word is. And so, you know, you have these levels, and they're highly covered. Putting a name or a number to that collaboration is hard to say. It's probably not a very large set of numbers. It's you don't win in this by sort of having by large numbers. You win by having great people. It's same thing as with recruiting programmers. But, you know, and it's not only here. We saw the same thing in Iran. There is interesting enough, a forum there called Ajanya that was started in the same time period. Again, I'm not going to have the hard number, but 2003, 2004 by this guy Beroz Ice and his buddies, and they've been running it for years. They got shut down last year, the year before, and same thing. The Iranians wanted to develop sort of a hacking cadre, whatever the word is, and just sort of recruit and then be able to pick the best ones and then put them to work for IRGC and the like. And so, you know, it's all in the it's very incentivized for a state to do this if you don't have other sort of mechanisms for developing this. So yeah, no, it's right there.
Let me go ahead, Alex.
Suzanne, sorry, just to add to that, you know, if you're a state and you are wanting to have high-end cyber skills at your disposal, the reality is that, as we all know, if someone has high-end cyber skills, they can go and earn a lot of money elsewhere, right? So every you know, state intelligence agency that has this challenge finds it difficult to retain people who are at the top end of their skills. And so in some places, you know, they find a workaround, which is that they basically contract out, or they offer, you know, as Christopher says, you know, air cover to individuals in return for, to a highly skilled, in return for helping them out every once in a while.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'm assuming
that point, this actually gets me to, if we're going to mess with these guys, so Barros Eyes, the Iranian dude, he got put away for a bit. I think eventually, and the forum got shut down because they got into gambling, and obviously the mullahs weren't too keen on gambling, because they were using and advertising gambling stuff. And you know, when the good Dokachev got put away because he also overextended into things, he did things that I don't think the Russians appreciated, and he got a 6-year prison, or put in prison for 6 years. So maybe, you know, criminals tend to get involved in stuff. Maybe the trick here is to find out information on them and take out a full-page ad in Izvestia and publish that, or put it in you know, there are other games you can play to sort of mess with these guys. Maybe, I don't know. That's it.
yeah.
Certainly not enough to do, but
using information in creative ways. I'm guessing that operating a dark web infrastructure, like some of the ones that you've talked about, Al Shamuk or Maza, and keeping that going for more than 15 years can't be easy, because we're giving the sort of criminals a lot of credit, but there are also some pretty savvy, sophisticated capabilities and skill sets working for governments as well. So it's not easy to keep these organizations going. Can you do it though without having coverage from another government, a nation state sponsor?
And Christopher, do you want me to
yeah,
have a shot, and then I'm going to hand it over to you because you know about this stuff. So on Shamouk, or you know, for instance, Inspire magazine. I don't know if you remember, Inspire magazine started with a kind of a charismatic American stroke British stroke Yemeni called Anwar al-Awlaki, sitting down in Yemen, who really you know, was erudite in English, and so he issued you know, many issues of this magazine, which basically, do you remember, there was one about, you know, how you make a bomb in your kitchen, etc., etc.
Yeah.
In the end, yeah, I mean, Anwar is no longer with us, but you know, in the end, it proved difficult for them to keep publishing Inspire. But now what you find is that for the Islamic extremists, what's really important is just to keep some kind of life going in terms of publishing some stuff. And what they do is a combination of caching stuff around the internet, sometimes in big archive organizations, or even kind of academic organizations, where they cache some of their materials around, you know, violent jihadi films, etc. And they just pop their heads above the parapet every so often in a very diffuse world around the globe way. They use encrypted messaging apps like Telegram and WhatsApp, maybe not WhatsApp, but you know, Telegram and Threema and things like that to communicate, just, you know, long enough to be able to put some more material out there. And just the fact of showing that they are still communicating for them is enough in this period where, in their view, they've lost the territorial battle in Iraq, you know, and they're in a kind of interim phase before they start the cycle of jihad again. So it's a combination of encrypted messaging apps and caching stuff around the web, in sometimes even in Western countries.
Mm-hmm. Let me get to, we have about 10 more minutes, so let me do kind of a lightning round of all of the questions that have been coming in, and let's see how many of these we can get to. And both of you feel free to jump in to answer these questions. The first one, do hackers using the dark web need English language proficiency to operate on the US internet and access American networks?
no, you know, like them here now. Again, you get specific. So if we think about dark web very specifically as the onion network sort of thing, and the dark, like, there's plenty of stuff that is English, there's plenty of stuff that is Russian. Most of these Russian hacking forums that we've talked about, you know, but you know, short answer, no.
Mm-hmm.
Good English skills. So of course, from other perspectives, you know, we know that hacking in many ways depend on social engineering. And if you don't know the language, it's hard to socially engineer. So when we do collection from Recorded Futures perspective, when we're doing things in Russia, yes, having very, very good Russian skills is helpful. Having very good Chinese skills is helpful, right? And so on. So language skills matter, but in it technically, I guess you don't need it. But language skills are good.
It is useful. It's useful, Suzanne and Cresswell, I hope you agree, to have Russian if you are, purchasing, if you're visiting some of these forums where they're, selling access controls, et cetera. Some of these, sometimes some of these groups will only deal with Russian speakers.
You have to be good, be fast at it. You got to be good Russian skills, be fast at it, and know the slang and know how, and be a good negotiator.
Sort of like classic espionage requirements back in the day. Tim Williams asked, would you agree that the wider problem is the inherent ambiguity of technology, meaning the same platform can be used for positive or negative results? This gets back to sort of the age-old question of, is now this new technology just another tool with the same desire for good and bad in order to access it? Would you agree?
The computer scientist in me would say that, yes, these machines, regardless of what it is, they're Turing machines that can be used for essentially anything. And, so they're not just dual use, they're infinite use. And yes, that's why I don't think anybody predicted when, Zuckerberg cooked up Facebook that it would be used to sort of get in our heads. But, certainly somebody figured that out. So yes, I don't know, Alex, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of, the old days when, you'd get a letter that said, I'm opening a bank account in Nigeria and I could do with some help, etc. And actually this has just allowed people to, people who wouldn't ever have dreamed of doing something in the US to sit back in another country and do it in the US.
And do it faster. Matthew Brazil says, greetings, great presentation, gentlemen. He says Beijing initiated a military and intelligence reorganization in 2015 that created the Strategic Support Force, reorganized the PLA Second Department into an intelligence bureau, and gave the Ministry of State Security a wider set of foreign responsibilities, including cyber espionage. Can you give us an outline of your understanding about these organizations and what they might be doing 5 years from now that could be different from today? And Matthew's done great briefings for us in the past on Chinese espionage. It's a great question, forcing us to look ahead a little bit. What do you think, Christopher?
Sure. Yeah, no, look, I think that was obviously at the time of the Obama-Xi sort of agreement on, no, don't hack each other. Yeah, biggest naive comment ever. But it maybe, in that at that time, the dear PLA guys who also then got reorganized stopped targeting the US, maybe. At least sort of using the same tool sets that they've been using before. And they went elsewhere and focused on Southeast Asia and other places. And MSS to that point went, much broader and have been going as aggressively as anywhere. And I think our view is that these organizations are, first of all, in simple terms, both, but also with all their sort of sub-elements to them, are both aggressively going after a wide set of targeting across the world. They also both use, and maybe MSS even more, use outsourced organizations, whether it's a local supercomputing center in Hebei or, a university in XYZ place. I'm too bad at Chinese names, but, they, especially MSS, loves to use these sort of whatever outsourced units, and they keep aggressively going after things. And on top of that, especially on MSS, maybe seeing the mix up with criminal activity. So let's see, what in ultimate outcome post that reorg? I don't know if it really has led anything to so different, more than that for people like ourselves. We've had to rewrite a whole bunch of reports and rewrite a whole bunch of designations to make sure that we track it properly. That's probably my view. So, Alex.
Yeah, I think that the one thing that is different with the kind of Chinese scenarios is that where you can really point a finger to things going on, sometimes you get a reaction that is positive. I wouldn't overdo that, but sometimes, so there can be more dialogue. I completely agree with what Christopher said on the kind of federated model, and I think very often you can see the traces of the latest 5-year plan in what is guiding the activity.
Let me ask you, so
I'll add a point to this. I'll steal a point from my good friend Dan Gear, he spoke at our user conference at Recorded Future 4 or 5 years ago, and he sort of laid it out and he has a way of speaking very simple terms. And he just said, look, if China as a state says that they're going to grow at 8%, and you know that the inherent growth rate is 5, or we'll just take that, whatever, that gap of 3% to fill it, what are you going to do? You're going to invade another country, go take oil from somebody, or you're going to steal intellectual property. There are only so many things you can do. If you know that if you're at 5, you need to get to 8, because if you're not at 8, you're going to have revolution on your hands. So the incentives are high for the state to make sure that you hit 8, and I could be wrong about 8, but if the incentive is high to hit 8, you're going to do what's needed. And if that involves that one of the simple paths or single paths you've come up with is to steal intellectual property, that government will steal intellectual property. And stealing intellectual property, what are you going to do? You're going to send your spies around the world. They are. B, they're going to hack. Just, hoover up drawings, whatever you can get your hands on. It's again, pretty simple in terms of at the high level of the why. And so that's why I think in 5 years, what can we predict that China is going to be doing? They're going to be doing more of this.
I think it's a very basic way to break it down and make it super easily understandable. So let me ask you, gentlemen, both of you, in closing, and I told you this hour was going to go by extremely fast. I can't believe it's already been an hour. But let me, I'm going to expose the nerd in me for a second and remind you, because I think you both may recall the days of the movie The Terminator, and you have, Arnold Schwarzenegger in his heyday, portraying a robot sent back in time. All of it was just so outrageously like it would never happen. And now we're seeing things that may lead to a future that someone imagined. If you were to look at what's going on today, and look at sort of the geopolitical events, because we're taking what you're learning in the dark web and we're putting it into context, what would be your fear for the future, or what would be, your Arnold Schwarzenegger movie that you feel like we need to wake up to right now?
Christopher, did you want to go first?
I think we have two things going on. A, things are getting more interconnected than ever, and they feel pretty interconnected already, but I think it's going to get to a whole different level. I've had this picture that I've shown recently where I show the Department of Treasury in DC on a F-35 jet, and I say, how many paths are there from the one to the other? And, people, oh, they're air-gapped. No, they're not air-gapped. It's sort of everything is ridiculously connected. I think we're going to see many more of sort of Russia, China, and so on trying to air-gap whole countries. But I think the connectiveness is going to win, and it's going to, what we've talked about here in terms of what Russia and China can do and will do, the willingness to do that is going to, we're not just the willingness, the capability to do that is going to end up in the hands of many more. And the sort of what I think we saw here with DarkSide, the thing that made it somewhat scary was that, it feels like a gang, and, the way it's written about, that it's, these 450 guys sitting in a basement, there's probably 2 guys, so if they can pull that off, we have some very interesting times in front of us. Yeah. So I don't think it's great, and it's not going to get any better.
I think Suzanne, it's exactly as Christopher said. It's about the multiplier effect. Yeah. And so the multiplier effect can be 2 guys in a basement who do a supply side attack, which kind of hits a lot of corporate America. That would be one thing, or it could be taking down a big cloud service server, an Amazon thing. But it could also be like, one of the things that keeps me awake at night a bit is, what if they had a crack at the algorithms that make up the kind of AI and machine learning? So every corporate will have been thinking over the last 2 or 3 years, how can I increase my commercial effectiveness with AI? And those algorithms, as they put them in place, and they've rushed to put them in place as fast as they can, we haven't all as a community maybe thought about the protection of those algorithms as much as we should do.
I think it's an excellent point, and one that we've also heard come up in our series that we're doing on artificial intelligence as hey, we've got to take a breather for a moment and make sure that this is built the right way initially, and that we've checked these algorithms for things that may lead to
There
We're
will be
too fast,
breather.
sir.
There
Yes.
will be breather. That's the important part. It's
Yeah.
going to go very fast.
Yeah, that's the problem. That's the problem with this age that we're in, is technology is moving so quickly that I think the rest of the world is struggling to keep up. I'd like to thank our incredible speakers today, Christopher Ahlberg and Alex Cresswell. I learned a lot. I'm pretty sure that the hundreds of folks who dialed in learned a lot. Thank you so much to both of you. Also to Charity Wright for the fantastic sort of primer. We're going to also be recording this session. We have recorded it, and we will have a version of this on the website as well, and on our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone who you're like, hey, you've really got to just take an hour of your day and educate yourself on this issue, we'll put out links for that in our newsletter. I also want to thank Recorded Future for their incredible support of this webcast. Be sure to use the regular web to get details on the Cipher Briefs 2020 Threat Conference in Sea Island, Georgia. It's happening in October this year. It's happening in person. There are a limited number of seats available, so I strongly recommend that you reserve yours today. It's like an in-person version of what we've just done on a multitude of different topics. Check the Cipher Briefs daily newsletter for upcoming information on that, as well as future web briefings. From myself, the Cipher Brief team, our Recorded Future partners, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Christopher. Really appreciate your time today.